Okay, so now we are going to start with 2:24, which is Jesus is betrayed and arrested. All right. This is one of the things that is mentioned in all four of the Gospels. There's detail in all of that. If you've noticed as you've been following along, very few things have all four of the Gospels that discuss them. There's usually maybe two, possibly three, but very few have four. This one does. Let's look at Matthew 26 and see what that says. And it says, while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd, armed with swords and clubs, sent from the high priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them, and the signal was, the one I kiss is the man, arrest him. So going at once to Jesus, Judas said, greetings, Rabbi. What he would have said is, shalom, Rabbi, and kissed him. Jesus replied, do what you came for, friend. Then the men stepped forward, and they seized Jesus, and they arrested him. With that, one of Jesus' companions, we know that it was Peter from another one of the Gospels, reached for his sword, drew it out, and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. John tells us that that man's name was Malchus, and that he cut off the ear of the high priest. Jesus turns to him and says, put your sword back in its place, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Now listen to this. He looks at Peter and he says, do you think that I could not call my Father, and he will not put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? A legion is 6,000. Okay, that's the number. And so he's not saying I only have 72,000 angels. He's saying any number of angels I could call. Do you not know that all I would have to do is say, Father, send them to protect me, and it would be done? But then, how would the scriptures be fulfilled that said it would happen this way? In that hour, Jesus said, am I leading a rebellion that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, but you did not come and arrest me. But this has all taken place that the writing of the prophets might be fulfilled. And then I've underlined this sentence. It says, and then all of the disciples deserted and fled away. So John gives us a little more detail, and a little interesting detail I'm going to share with you. It says, now Judas, who had betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. That's the Garden of Gethsemane. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the high priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches and lanterns and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, who is it that you want? Jesus of Nazareth, they replied. I am he. And Judas the traitor was standing there with him. And when Jesus said, I am he, the soldiers drew back and fell backwards onto the ground. You would think that would be a red flag. This doesn't seem like a wise thing to do, guys. I am he. And they all just went backwards. Isn't that amazing? And so the very men that come out to arrest him and to take him prisoner are now laying on the ground in front of him, in front of the man that they are going to arrest. So again, he asks them, who is it that you want? Now, if they were smart, they would have kept their mouths shut, but they did not. They said, Jesus of Nazareth. Once again, he says, I am he. This time they do not fall over backwards, but he's certainly made his point, hasn't he? He's made the point of what it is. And he's identifying himself. He's not hiding. He's not trying to avoid them. He says, I am he. If you are looking for me, then let the men go. This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. I have not lost one of those that you have given to me. That was one of the previous things that he had prayed to the Father. I've not lost any that you have given to me. So when Jesus says, let the men go, then we read from the other scripture that they fled. They're just like, yep, we're out of here, and off they go. Now, isn't that pretty amazing? This is their rabbi. This is the man that they have followed for 3 years, and something bad is about to happen, and they turn and run. So it's nighttime. The Passover was just a few hours earlier. We've been through so much information that it feels like that was a long time ago. It's the same night. It's the same night of that Passover Seder meal that they had participated in. And now we're getting into the deepest, darkest part of the night. So far, the Jewish leaders had already broken 2 of the rules. No bribe should result in an arrest, and no criminal proceeding should occur after sunset. That's 2 of the rules that they had in there. And the arresting forces came in large numbers. Now, we know by the names that they had given them that there was a multitude of them. There were temple police, there were Sadducee leaders, there were Pharisee leaders, and there was also a band of Roman soldiers. How did the Roman soldiers get involved in this is the interesting thing at this point. Because remember, up to this point, Rome hasn't got a big interest in Jesus of Nazareth.
I can answer that. Because they're the ones, that's how they did things with the crucifixion.
Yes.
So they were in on it.
Yes, absolutely.
And I haven't been here.
Absolutely, good for you. And so when Judas goes and betrays him, Jesus to the high priest and tells them what he's willing to do, and they pay him and they get that all set up again, it's obvious that they at that point had some Roman soldiers go with them to arrest. So the temple guard and all of them, they were all together and they all go. Rome is now going to be drawn into this, and as we go through with the rest of today's lesson, you're going to see how they now become a part of it. But keep in mind that up until this point, Rome could care less about a Jewish Messiah. What does it matter to them? That's a religious matter. It has no bearing on them whatsoever up to this point. But now, through God's providence, through the plan, through what needs to be accomplished, Rome needs to be drawn into this. All right, after Judas would betray Jesus at the temple priest, they're going to go to Pontius Pilate, and they're going to accuse Jesus of a crime under Roman law, because that's all they're going to be concerned about it. Pilate would have been in Jerusalem for the feast days. That was what the governor of Jerusalem would be in Jerusalem during the meeting of the feast days, and he would know exactly what's going on at the temple. So the men falling over backwards at that comment. Sometimes commentary will talk about why is that important? What would that have done? Well, I'm certain that it made an impression on everyone who saw it. And I'm certain that it showed the power and the authority and the might of Jesus. And to the reader today, to those of us looking at it, what does it tell us? He didn't go because they came and slapped handcuffs on him, or that they came and physically restrained him. That's not why he went. He chose to go with those people because while they were laying down on the ground, it would have taken nothing for him to have turned and walked away. But that's not the plan. That's not the plan. So while they're on the ground, he says, who is it that you're looking for? You. And so he waits for them to do what it is that needs to be done. All right. When the disciples realize that Jesus is doing nothing to defend himself, he's not fighting against anything, they lose their courage and they turn and they flee. All right. Let's move on to 225. Annas questions Jesus. So, there are a few things to tell you about Annas. Caiaphas is the high priest at that time. Annas is his father-in-law. Annas was a high priest during the early years, of about 6 to about, I don't know, maybe 10, 12 years. He's the high priest until a Roman governor kicks him out of office and puts in Caiaphas, who is his son. But the thing of it is that Annas remains the lead figure for many, many, many years to come. Even though he's not officially in the title, he has sons that take the position, and he has a son-in-law that takes the position, and he rules and reigns through them. And so he's a very important man. He is the one who organized the temple area where they sold all the animals. It would have been the tables of Annas that Jesus would have overthrown when he went in and cleared out the table of the money changers. He was not known as a good man. He was not known as a good high priest, but he was a good politician. And he knew how to make things happen at that point. Now, John 12 through 24. The detachment of soldiers with its commanders and Jewish officials arrested Jesus. So they're in the garden, they've now arrested him. They bound him and first brought him to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jewish leaders that it would be good if one man died for the people. So you remember when he said that. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, we believe that was John, came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. "You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you?" she asked Peter. He replied, "Oh, I am not." It was cold, and the servants and the officials stood around a fire that they had made to keep warm. Peter was also standing with them, warming himself. Meanwhile, the high priest, this would have been Annas, questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus says, "I have spoken openly to the world. I always taught in the synagogues at the temple where all the Jews came together. I said nothing in secret. Why are you questioning me? Ask those who heard me teach. Surely they will know what I said." When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby turned and slapped him across the face. "Is this the way you speak to the high priest?" he demanded. "If I said something wrong," Jesus replied, "tell me what is wrong. But if I speak the truth, why would you strike me?" Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Okay, so this is the first of what's to come. This is the first time we see Jesus actually get manhandled by anyone. And because he answers the high priest and doesn't just acquiesce to what it is that he's saying, they strike him across the face. This is the first stage of the religious trial. The purpose is to establish a religious charge against Jesus. So these events had happened really quickly, and we will see as we move along that they did not have everything prepared and ready for the arrest. Remember, they did not want to arrest Jesus during the feast time. Remember that? They didn't want to arrest him when there were a lot of people around, and they didn't want to arrest him during the Passover. But events happened very quickly with Judas and what was going on. Of course, we know that it was God's timeline. It's exactly how it needed to happen. But it happened quicker than they knew it was going to happen, and they did not have everything ready. Charges had not even yet been made, and there were not any witnesses available. This was a trial, however, where the verdict had already been determined and the sentence had already been determined. The first person they brought Jesus to was Annas. He served as the high priest until, here's the dates, AD 6 until AD 13, where he had then been kicked out of his position by the Roman governor. Annas still retained control of the position because he had 5 sons, a son-in-law, and finally a grandson who took that position. You'll notice too that many of the rules were broken. If you remember, I gave you that little list of all the things. They've already broken about 8 or 10 of them on what needs to be done. There was never supposed to be a trial before the morning sacrifice, and yet they did it. It was always to be held in public with witnesses, and yet they did it in secret. Annas accuses Jesus on 2 levels. He goes after his disciples, and he goes after his teaching. However, Jesus insisted on his rights under the Jewish civil law. I've never taught in secret, he says. In other words, I have nothing to hide. According to the law, 2 or 3 witnesses would need to be provided in order to witness against any charges that would have been brought against him, and they do not bring any witnesses. Because they don't bring any witnesses, Jesus has no legal obligation to answer anything they say to him. And so when he answers back and says, I have nothing to hide, and they slap him, he certainly was doing everything that he needed to do. All right. 2:26, the next thing is going to happen. Caiaphas is going to get involved. Caiaphas is going to question Jesus. I'm reading from Matthew 26 here, starting at verse 57. It says, those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the teachers of the law and the elders had assembled. But Peter followed from a distance, right up to the courtyard of the high priest. If you go to Israel today, they've uncovered a building that they believe is actually the home of Caiaphas. And so it's down underneath. You have to go down into it because, of course, everything's been layered on top of it. A very nice, he would have been a very wealthy man. He would have had a big courtyard in his home, and they have that available. You can actually see that home. But Peter followed at a distance at the courtyard. He sat down with the guards to see the outcome of what happened. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin would be 71 of the Sanhedrin. We're looking for false evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. False evidence. These are religious leaders. The religious leaders are looking for someone to lie about Jesus so that they can file a charge against him. But they did not find any, although many false witnesses came forward. What would that mean? That would mean they came forward, they spilled some kind of a lie, but it was easily put down. It couldn't be substantiated. There was no way that they could prove it, or some of them may have been just so ridiculous they just threw them out. So none of those would work. Finally, 2 came forward and declared, this fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you? But Jesus remained silent. The high priest said to him, I charge you under oath by the living God. You tell us, are you the Messiah, the Son of God? You have said so, Jesus replied. But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One, God, and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, he has spoken blasphemy. Why do we even need any witnesses? Look now, you have heard blasphemy. What do you think? He turns to all of the people that are with him. Oh, he is worthy of death, they said. So they spit in his face, and they struck him with their fists. Others slapped him and said, so prophesy to us, you Messiah, who hit you? So obviously this is a false trial. It's very easy to just read the outline of it and see. All they're doing is trying to bring someone in who will make a charge that will stick so that they can put him to death. They've already decided he's going to be put to death. They just have to find a way to do it. That's all. And so blasphemy is what they are going to charge him with. Keep in mind that that is a Jewish charge. Do you think Rome is going to care about that? Rome could care less if he's telling them that he is the Messiah. So the tearing of the clothes, the renting of the clothes, that's also something that a high priest is not allowed to do. And so again, we see another law being broken here. It's anger, it's grief. It's usually done in grief. In this case, it's done in anger and grief by the high priest as he does that. He is worthy of death. There's no trial, there's no witnesses. We don't know exactly what the charge is going to be, but he's worthy of death. And so they begin to beat him. All right, let's see if there's anything that I didn't get that. All right, so that would have been blasphemy. So now we've seen Peter, and we've seen what Peter is doing. He's following along. He's kind of tucking away. He's watching what's going on. And he has already said that he doesn't know who Jesus is. Now, 2:27, Peter denies knowing Jesus. Let's look at Matthew 26, starting with 69. It says, Peter was sitting in the courtyard, that one that we just talked about, and a servant girl came to him and said, "You were with Jesus of Galilee," she said, and he denied it. "I don't even know what you're talking about." Then he went out to the gateway where another servant girl saw him and said to the people there, "This fellow was with that Jesus of Nazareth." He denied it, this time with an oath. We don't even want to know what he said. And he said, "I don't know that man." After a little while, those standing there went up to Peter and said, "Surely you are one of those men. Your accent from Galilee gives you away." Then he began to call down curses, and he swore to them and said, "I don't know that man." The term used in the Greek to call down curses is a verb, meaning that he's calling down curses upon something. Upon Jesus? Upon the ministry? Upon what is he calling down curses? But what we see is that every time he denies, he gets a little more adamant, doesn't he? Until at the end, he's calling down curses and making oaths while saying that he does not know that man. Immediately the cock crowed. And Jesus remembered the words, "Before the cock crow, you will deny me 3 times." And he went outside of the courtyard and he wept bitterly. All right, not a proud moment for our Peter, is it? Right, 2:28. The council of religious leaders condemns Jesus. Now we're into Matthew 27. And I'm going to be, and Mark 15 and Luke 22. I'm going to be using my reading from Luke 22. It says, "As soon as it was day, the elders of the people, both the chief priests and the scribes, came together and led him into their council and said, 'If you are the Christ, tell us.'" Okay, let's just back up for a minute. Nighttime is over with. They've taken him secretly in. He's met with Annas. He got slapped in the face. He went to Caiaphas. He got beat up and punched, and all of those things began to happen. His disciples have all fled away. Peter has now denied him 3 times. Now the daylight is breaking, and they bring him into the council of the elders, and they ask him the same thing. "If you are the Messiah, if you are the Messiah, tell us." How many times has he told them?
1,000,000.
1,000,000. 1,000,001. And they keep continuing to ask him. But he says to them, "If I tell you, you are not going to believe me. But if I also ask you, you will by no means answer me or let me go. From hereafter, the Son of Man will sit at the right hand of the power of God." Are you saying you are the Son of God? And he said to them, "You rightly say that I am." And they said, "What further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own mouth." Okay, Matthew 27, when morning came, all of the chief priests and the elders of the people plotted against Jesus to put him to death. That's really all they're looking for. And when they had bound him, they led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate, the governor. So that's going to be the next phase. So at this point, the trial was over. The verdict had been issued. However, in order to maintain appearances, the morning group that had arrived and was questioning Jesus begins again, "Are you the Messiah?" He tells them that he is. Since they have heard it, probably in the presence of other people who were not around in the nighttime trial, they now believe that they have no problem proving their point. They don't even feel like they need witnesses. And so now they are going to take him to Pontius Pilate. They were going to need Rome if they were going to get the death penalty for Jesus. Remember that it is after the resurrection of Lazarus, way back when we were talking about Lazarus. When he raises Lazarus from the dead, the Sanhedrin had already decided at that point that they were going to kill him. So they've just been waiting for how this was going to lay out. Why were they going to kill him? Because he raised a man from the dead. This is religious leaders. He had raised a man from the dead. That was going to cause a problem for them, and so they were looking for the perfect time. The manner of death must be crucifixion, and so Rome is now going to get involved. 229, Judas kills himself. This story is only found in the book of Matthew 27. The other gospel writers just choose not to even address it. It says in verse 3, when Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse. It doesn't say he repented. It says he was seized with remorse. And he returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. I have sinned, he said, for I have betrayed innocent blood. Remember the story of Zechariah? What did God tell him to do? He told him, go in there and throw that 30 pieces of silver that they pay you back on the temple floor. Prelude to what Judas is going to do. Here's the answer they give him. What is that to us? That you have betrayed innocent blood. That's your responsibility. So Judas threw the money into the temple and he left. And then he went away and he hanged himself. Then the chief priests picked up the coins and said, it's against the law to put this back into the treasury because this is blood money. So they decided to use the money to buy the potter's field as a burial place for foreigners. That is why it has been called the field of blood to this very day. This was what was spoken of by Jeremiah the prophet when it was fulfilled. And it's that story that I just told you. They took the 30 pieces of silver and used them to buy a potter's field. He uses Jeremiah there instead of Zechariah. It actually comes from Zechariah 11, verses 12 and 13. There's a lot of people that talk about why was Jeremiah in there. It's really a very easy answer because in the scroll of Jeremiah, Zechariah was contained in that scroll. And so it's the scroll of Jeremiah, but it's the scripture is actually quoted from Zechariah. It wouldn't have been a big deal for them. It's a big deal for us because we have it divided up into a lot of different books. All right, the only other man we read about hanging himself is a man from the Old Testament. It was a man who counseled and a friend of King David's. He betrayed David when he went with his son Absalom during the rebellion against David. And you can find the story in 2 Samuel 15, verses 12. And he goes out after he gets caught and he hangs himself. And that's really the only other time we read about someone, some Jewish person hanging themselves. That was not the way Jewish people did it. It was not a common thing for them to do. But in this particular case, he does. And we're told in Acts, when they talk about Judas, they state that his body burst asunder and his bowels came out. How would that have happened? It probably would have happened because in the hot desert sun, the body would have only hung for so long before it would have fallen, and it would have been horrible and gross and disgusting. But that is the way that he chose to die, and it would have been a very public thing for everyone to see, and a very unlikely way for a Jewish man to do it. All right, 2:30, Jesus stands trial before Pilate. Again, this one is mentioned in all four of the Gospels. John chapter 18 says, then the Jewish leaders take Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. That would be Pilate. By now it's early morning, so we're moving along in the timeline. And to avoid ceremonial uncleanliness, they did not want to enter into the palace because they would not be able to participate. So Pilate came to them and said, what charge are you bringing me against this man? So they bring him to Pilate, but they don't even want to go in because it'll make them ceremonially unclean. Remember, Passover, and then there's 7 days of unleavened bread. So they have to be, for 8 days, they have to remain ceremonially clean. So they don't even want to go into the Gentile palace. So he comes out to them. Pilate comes out to them. What's the charge, he says? And they say, if he were not a criminal, we would not bring him to you. Well, there's a charge. They still don't even have the charge. But we do not have the right to execute anyone, they objected. This took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death that he was going to die. Crucifixion. That's been mentioned several times here now, hasn't it? Scripture needs to be fulfilled in exactly the correct manner. So, Jesus went back into the palace, and he had Jesus brought out to him, and he says, are you the king of the Jews? Now, wait a minute. Is that something that they have accused him of up to this point? No. They have not said that. They certainly don't want to say that he's the king of the Jews. Let's think about why would Pilate think that that was such an important thing to ask them? We'll get to that in just a second. Jesus says, is that your own idea, or did the others talk to you about me? Pilate replied, am I a Jew? Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it that you have done? Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place. So Pilate says, aha, you are a king then? Jesus answered, you say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone who is on the side of truth will listen to me. What is truth? Pilate retorts. With this, he went out again to the Jews gathered there and says, I really find no basis for any charge against this man. So Pontius Pilate was a Roman governor who had a very rocky relationship with the Jews and the Samaritans. He had not governed them well, and there had been a great deal of problems. He was a very violent man. He was known. He had a reputation for being very savage. He had one time tried to bring in an image of the emperor and put it on the military guards' shields, and the Jewish people had a fit about it because they didn't believe in bringing in any imagery. He also took money from the Jewish temple and built a big aqueduct, a water aqueduct that came into Jerusalem. He took money from the temple to do that, and the people were not happy about that. He was certainly not a man that would be in the mood to deal with the Jewish leaders, and he was not really concerned about a very unimportant Jewish man, but deal with them he must. So what charges do you have, he said? If he were not a criminal, why would we bring him? All of that is just showing that Jesus did not have any charges against him. So what is interesting is that the power to execute had been removed from the Jewish people less than a year before this time. It had been taken away from them, and they were no longer able to execute people themselves without Roman interference. Now, it still did occur in a few cases, but the power to execute had been removed from them. God had prepared the Roman government and the Jewish leaders for the plan that was to take place. The prophecies would be fulfilled. And so if they didn't need Pontius Pilate, they would have taken care of Jesus themselves and very likely would have stoned him. That's the way that it would have been done. But that's not how Jesus was to die. And so the power to execute him had been taken from them and now strictly lay with the Roman government, and so they would need to get involved. So why does he ask him if he is a king? Well, there's only one thing that the Roman government is going to be interested in. Is this man a threat to Caesar? Sedition. Is he somehow thinking that he is going to come in and take over some sort of authority of Caesar's emperor? Is he a threat to me? Pontius Pilate would ask. Because the Messiah thing doesn't bother me a bit, he says. But if he is calling himself a king and stating that he has a kingdom, then he could be a threat to Caesar. So in verse 27, these details are added. When he is accused by the chief priests and the elders, he gave no answer. And then Pilate said, "Don't you hear all the testimony they're bringing against you?" But Jesus made no reply, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. While they were throwing everything that they could think of at him, someone thinks of one more thing. Luke 23 says, "But they insisted, he stirs up the people all over Judea by his teaching. He started up in Galilee, and he's come all the way down here teaching." Oh, that was all Pontius Pilate needed. Oh, that's a good little piece of information. Pontius Pilate was in control of Judea and Samaria and all the Jerusalem area. There was somebody else in control of Galilee. Herod. Herod's in control of Galilee. If he's stirring up trouble in Galilee, send him up to Herod. Let Herod deal with him. 231, Jesus stands trial before Herod. When Herod saw Jesus, he was greatly pleased because for a long time he had been wanting to see him. From what he had heard about him, he hoped to see him perform a sign of some sort. He plied him with many questions, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and the teachers of the law were standing there, accusing him. Then Herod and his soldiers ridiculed and mocked him. They dressed him up in elegant robes, and then they sent him back to Pilate. That day, Herod and Pilate became friends. Previous to that time, they had been enemies. So they linked up over this one event. It's a short little verse about Herod. What we know about Herod Antipas, he was the seventh and the youngest son of Herod the Great. You remember who Herod the Great was? He's the one that killed all the babies in Bethlehem. He was dedicated to building massive buildings, but history never portrays him as a very great leader. There's one thing that you know about Herod Antipas, probably more than anything else, and it has to do with John the Baptist. It's that Herod. It's the one who beheads him because he marries his brother's wife. And so it's this guy. In fact, at one point in Mark chapter 6, verse 16, Herod thinks that there's a possibility that Jesus is John the Baptist resurrected. And so he had heard about all of the miracles that Jesus had performed and was waiting anxiously for Jesus to come and do some tricks. Really, that was what he was hoping for, that Jesus would come and perform some, turn the water into wine, or turn this into bread, or do some magic for us. Jesus stands there silently as he asks him questions and things that needed to be done. And finally, Herod gets fed up with it. They ridicule him. They dress him up in some robes if he's something special, and they make fun of him. And they decide to send him back to Pontius Pilate. So as a side note, Herod will pay a big price for his life of evil. Herodias, his evil wife, talked Herod into going into the emperor and asking to be made king of the area. That's what she was hoping for. Caligula is the current emperor, not a good man. And when Herod and Herodias come and request that, he puts them, what is that called? He banishes them out, and they live in poverty for the rest of their lives. So Jesus is now going to go back to Pilate. 232, Pilate hands Jesus over to be crucified. Pilate called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, and he said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was inciting the people to rebellion. I have examined him in your presence, and I see no reason for your charges against him. Neither is Herod. He sent him back to us. So as you can see, he has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore, I will punish him, and then I'm going to release him." But the whole crowd started shouting, "Away with this man! Away with this man! Release Barabbas to us." Barabbas had been thrown into prison for an insurrection in the city. He had murdered a man. Wanting to release Jesus, think about that, wanting to release Jesus, Pilate appeals to them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" For the third time he spoke to them and said, "Why? What is the crime this man has committed? I really have found no grounds for the death penalty, but I will have him punished, and then I will release him to you." But with loud shouts, they insistently demanded that he be crucified, and their shouts prevailed. So Pilate decided to grant their demand. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, the one that they had asked for, Barabbas, and surrendered Jesus to their will. In Mark 27, there's a little bit of detail when Pontius Pilate is saying, "What has he done? What do you want me to do?" And they say, "Crucify him." Verse 24 says, when Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but instead that an uproar had started, he took some water and he washed his hands in front of the people, and he said, "I am innocent of this man's blood. It is now your responsibility." And all of the people shouted, "His blood will be upon us and our children." And then he released Barabbas to them. But he had Jesus flogged, and he handed him over to be crucified. So to his credit, Pontius Pilate tries several times to release a man that he knows is innocent before he bends to the will of the people. He knows that he hasn't done anything worthy of death. There was a custom at the time of Passover that as a sign of goodwill, the governor would release one of the criminals to the people. They generally had an opportunity to ask for who they wanted. They would be given a second chance. Barabbas is the man at this time who they offer up to him. The people choose a murderer over Jesus. Matthew 27:19 adds the detail. While Pilate was sitting at the judge's seat, his wife sent him a message saying, "Don't have anything to do with that innocent man. I have suffered today a great deal because of a dream that I have had about him." So his wife is dreaming about it and sends that message while he's sitting there in front of the people and in front of Jesus. She says, "Don't do anything to him. I've had a dream." Now, does he wash his hands before or after he hears that? I don't know. He thinks he's making himself innocent of all of that. The plan of God needed to move forward, and nothing was going to stop it. And it says he had Jesus flogged in verse 26 and handed over. Flogging was a very familiar method of punishment. The Jews used it. In fact, in 2 Corinthians verse 11, Paul says, "I was flogged 5 times by the Jews." And he survived. Jewish punishment had very strict laws. They used a leather or a wooden handle, and they had a short thing that had little leather straps off of it. They would beat the back of the person, usually a man, occasionally a woman caught in adultery. And they would beat the back of that person no more than 40 times. 40 was the maximum. And so, as you know, the Jews are sticklers for following the rules. So they had what was known as 40 minus 1. So they would only beat someone 39 times, because heaven forbid you should miscount and beat them 41. So they would beat them 39 times in order to give themselves an out. 40 times was the method that they would have. Jesus was not flogged by the Jewish method. Jesus was flogged by the Roman method. The movies you see where they count down as they're flogging Jesus in the movies, I've seen plenty of them. 1, 2, 3, and it just grows in intensity till you get to the end of that. That's not what it was. This is a Roman flogging. The Romans were very good at torture. And so the Roman method for flogging was they would have a wooden handle with straps that were very long. 18 to 24 inches long is about the length of the ones that they have found. Very long. At the end of each one of them was tied either a nail or a piece of glass or a shard of pottery or even a sharp bone from a lamb. At the end of every one of those. So while the Jews could beat the back, and that was bad enough, the Romans could go all around the entire body. 24 inches is enough to go completely around the body. And nothing was off limit. They would beat the head, they would beat the face, they would beat the legs, they would beat the neck. And all of it had these little bits at the end of every single one of them. And so the beating wasn't just lacerations, it would cut open and expose muscle. And even then, the beating would continue on top of the muscle and rip the muscle. When the face would be whipped and beat. So when scripture says he didn't even look human, that he was not even human. Isaiah 52:14 says, just as there were many who were appalled at him, his appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being, and his form was marred beyond any human likeness. By the time the Romans got done with someone, he would have been unrecognizable. Many people did not live through a Roman flogging. You can see why. We know that Jesus was going, we already know that he's not going to physically be able to carry his own cross. This is why. And guess what? The Romans didn't believe in the 40 lashes rule. Traditionally, the Romans beat a man until the executioner got tired, till his arm was sore. It's a far different thing than a Jewish flogging. This is a method of execution unto itself. And Pilate thinks that this is going to be enough. This is going to be enough to please the people. But it wasn't. Because Jesus isn't going to die by flogging. That's not the prophetic word. That's not what's going to happen. Next, we read that he was handed over for crucifixion. So we'll start there next week as we get to that point. All right, are there any questions or comments about any of that?
What's the number of that one?
The one that we just finished?
No, the one that you're gonna start next week.
Next week, we will be starting on, let me see where we ended. 232 is where I ended, so we'll start on 233 next week. All right. I know it's really difficult, isn't it? All right, I'm going to pray for us, and then I'm going to hand out your questions for next week. Let me turn this off.